Welcome to this evening's presentation hosted by the ACT chapter of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Great to have you here tonight. It's a combination of people in person here in Deakin, Canberra, and our online Zoom audience. My name's Phil Dyack. I'm a counsellor with the local chapter, and I'm very pleased to chair this event this evening featuring Stephen Dziedzic, who is the ABC's Foreign Affairs reporter with a special focus on the Asia Pacific. We're no doubt used to Stephen's excellent reporting and analysis on foreign relations and related matters for the ABC. He's meticulous to a fault, covering an issue and in providing clear explanations on matters relating to Australian foreign policy for the viewing and listening public. And for me, it's a listen up moment whenever he appears on TV. For tonight, Stephen has indicated that he'll talk mostly around how the media environment is impacted on the coverage of foreign policy in Australian politics and vice versa, but he's happy to take questions on broader matters to do with Australian foreign policy. Before I pass to Stephen, just some brief housekeeping items. Tonight's event will run to 7 p.m. Eastern, with the time divided between Stephen's talk and followed by audience questions. I do encourage you to ask questions, and for our Zoom audience, you will need to type into the chat facility, and you can do that at any time on your Zoom page, and I'll relay your questions to Stephen during the Q&A segment, and I'll endeavour to get through as many questions as possible. With that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Stephen. Over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate it. Can everyone hear me up the back there? Okay, cool. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. What I hope to do is try and shed a little bit of light on the way the media covers foreign policy, some of the shifts that we've seen in the last 10 years, and then a couple of observations for what they're worth on Australian foreign policy under the new Labor government. I think I'm going to focus largely on the intersection between the news media and FP, just because it's what I know best. I hate this phrase like nothing else, but that's the value add I think I can bring. I'm happy, of course, to talk about foreign policy, but there are also many people, including many in this room, who are probably just as equipped, perhaps much better equipped to talk on the sort of particulars of Australian foreign policy. I don't profess to be a foreign policy expert. I'm just a close observer. So I'll try and draw out a few interesting trends as I see them in terms of foreign policy and the media and that interaction, and then take questions on whatever takes your fancy. All right, what's the first thing I want to say about covering foreign policy? The first thing is that news organisations, and I really hope you guys have noticed this as keen observers of foreign policy, is that news organisations have made the belated realisation that foreign policy matters. I cannot tell you how long it took us collectively to come to this realisation. So when I started at the ABC, I remember very, very clearly when I had sort of a very early inkling of an interest in foreign affairs, talking to a pretty senior editor, or a senior news person rather, and he said something along the lines of, foreign policy, that's what the wonks and the diplomats do, mate. If we need to, we'll go to the Lowy Institute. And that is really not much of a paraphrase. That's pretty much what he said. So there was this idea when I started in news, which was not that long ago, though perhaps longer than some people think, because I'm not 12, despite appearances. When I started out, there was still this idea that foreign policy was something that could be left to specialists and that diplomats took care of it. And if we really needed to devote column inches or TV time to it, then we'd get a wonk in to talk about what's happened, a retired ambassador or something like that. That changed, and it changed with startling rapidity around, I mean, it depends on how around, let's say, 2016, 2017. The ABC appointed me, or basically appointed me to a newish position around then, which was basically a foreign affairs reporter. Before then, they'd devoted me to, I took up a job covering the Pacific. And within about 9 months of doing that, we'd unearthed such a rich vein of stories that suddenly the appetite for these sort of stories began to grow. Interest, in particular in China, in the Pacific, grew. That coincided, obviously, with some pretty significant developments in the broader Australian in the broader Australian foreign policy firmament. And I was then appointed to the position of Foreign Affairs Asia Pacific reporter. Before then, the position didn't exist, right? No one was really covering foreign policy in any sort of particularly sustained way. Some reporters had an interest in it and did very good reporting occasionally, but the idea of devoting a reporter to this was basically unthinkable. So my brief was basically to try and do day-to-day reporting, explaining why foreign policy matters to the average Australian and why they should care about it. And that shift has in some ways really, I mean, it was probably sharpest in the ABC, but we've also seen it in other news organisations, which are now devoting more time, more effort, more bandwidth to foreign policy and foreign policy reporting. Second observation I'd make, in this regard, China is an enormous blessing and a bloody enormous curse simultaneously, because if there's one thing that you can absolutely guarantee will draw eyeballs in the interest of editors, it is, as we call it, pun intended, the C word, right? This is good in the sense that it's an easy hook. It's bad because anyone and everyone then assumes that every single foreign policy story, and in particular, every foreign policy story focused on Australian foreign policy, must inevitably come back to China, no matter what. And there is not a huge amount of appetite. Sometimes there are plenty of exceptions to this, to any nuance around that. Now, as it happens, I think personally that China is driving the vast bulk of Australian foreign policy across, for example, the Pacific, but it's not the whole story. There are other elements too. And because China is, one, so successful at drawing clicks and eyeballs, two, such a strong generator of newsroom interest, it can be difficult sometimes to avoid this sort of inevitable sense that every single story draws back to Beijing and what Australia fears Beijing may or may not do. That's a big part of Australian foreign policy, but again, it's not everything. It's not the sum total of it. The third thing I'd say briefly, it's still surprisingly difficult to get Australian listeners, readers, viewers to watch or read stories about our near region, and in particular, Southeast Asia. I cannot tell you how hard it is to get an Indonesia story up. This is not unique to the ABC. This is across the region. But we have produced, the ABC as one of the few organisations that does devote pretty substantial resources to Indonesia, are often surprised at how difficult it is to draw people into it. And it remains, I think, underdone in our coverage. In fact, hugely underdone in our coverage. Now, I don't know I don't know if we want to talk about blame. That's probably not helpful. Is that because news organisations simply haven't done a good enough job talking about our immediate region and why it matters to us? Are Australians simply criminally indifferent to Indonesia? I doubt it. Perhaps it's a bit of both. I don't know. But for whatever reason, it is still difficult to draw audiences into stories, in particular about Southeast Asia. It is easier increasingly to draw audiences into the Pacific, and not just with a China angle. That's one difference we have really noticed recently. That's partly because there's such intense geopolitical interest. Suspect a few other things are going on, but it's speculative. But it is still difficult. And the ABC's footprint, I wish this was Chatham House, but I'm sure my bosses are not going to be listening, so it's okay. It's probably still too heavily weighted towards North America and Europe and underweighted in our region. I think there's a recognition that that's happening, that that's the case. And I think we may well see resources devoted over time more to our region, but it's still, the balance is still not quite right in my personal view. Although I would note the ABC is increasingly pouring a lot of time, effort and energy as well as resources into the Pacific. For example, employing most recently 2 journalists full-time, one in Solomon Islands and one in Fiji, and also now expanding that to around another 3 or 4 countries in the coming months to file to our new flagship program, The Pacific, which is on Thursday nights, which I hope everyone watches and will continue to watch. It's very new. And also to file to our mainstream news platforms. But we're still, it's still hard to get audiences to really key into stories about our region. And 2, we're probably not weighted correctly. We're trying to rectify that, but it's a work in progress. Next observation I'll make, try not to go too long. Our traditional platforms are sadly, in many cases, hemorrhaging viewers. This is not a problem contained to the ABC. It's also other organisations as well. But increasingly, we are finding it difficult to engage young Australians. And the ABC, as is every other organisation, is currently engaged in a mad scramble to find ways to engage with them. Now, this is difficult, right? Because if young people are simply not interested in turning on the 7 p.m. news, not because they're in any way hostile to it, but simply because the idea of appointment viewing is alien to most, but those who are true news nerds, then we have to try and find ways to reach them. Now, the vast bulk of social media are people we know, young people we know get their news from social media. We have no choice but to try and meet them there. But if you're reporting, as I do, on something like foreign policy, it does not fit neatly into a 17-second TikTok video. It just doesn't. So it's hard. And what we are trying to do, and what I'm at the moment thinking really hard about, is how I can find ways to try and bring some of the coverage that we do on foreign policy on traditional platforms, with the 7 p.m. news, AM, PM, The World Today, online, how we bring that into some of these other platforms. It's a difficult challenge, but it's honestly an almost existential one for the ABC and for all news organisations, because if we simply stick with the traditional platforms, which we're very proud of, which do exceptional work, and don't try and meet younger, not just young, even younger, middle-aged Australians where they are, we are going to struggle. So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a few more announcements from the ABC and other organisations about that evolution over coming months. The risk, of course, is that we continue to, we devote huge amounts of time to platforms which are consumed largely by people with a keen interest in the subject matter, and we cater largely to elites, which is not sustainable. That's not what the ABC does. We have to cater to every Australian. We're obliged to do so under our charter. That's the absolute core of what we do. So that's another complicating factor in the current media environment on foreign policy. Look, I'll make a couple of other observations before I go to questions, because I'm really keen to make this as interactive as possible, particularly because as a journo, I've sat through a number of speeches thinking, get the questions already. So I don't want to be someone who rabbits on for too long, but I'll make a few other observations. The ABC, along with all sorts of other news organisations, are trying to make our newsrooms more diverse, because they're still not really representative of the broader Australian community. This is not a unique problem to the ABC. And I think over the last few years in particular, not just saying this because my bosses may be watching, I think we actually have made great strides in actually drawing in more diverse Australians into our newsroom. This is an absolutely critical challenge for the ABC, because if our newsrooms don't look like the broader population, that is a profound disconnect, and one that spells deep trouble for us in the long term. So we put a lot of effort trying to engage with what is sometimes termed diaspora communities. I actually don't love the term, just with Australians of different backgrounds, but in particular those who've got a keen interest in my space in things like politics of, let's say, the Khalistan movement, let's say in the Pacific, the interaction of labour schemes and the implications that have for diaspora communities here. They also bring an invaluable perspective to our coverage of foreign policy, and that's something that we're trying to draw on increasingly, because not only are they obviously totally literate, often in the politics of their countries, they often bring really useful insights onto Australian foreign policy and the approach that Australia takes to these countries. Of course, it also means, and this is the corollary, that it's often, particularly if we're talking about a sensitive issue like, say, Khalistan, it's on my mind because I've written a Khalistan story to go up tomorrow morning. You're dealing with people with very strong views, more forceful views than you might get in the general broader Australian population, and views and groups who are very likely in many instances, and there's nothing wrong with this, to complain or to launch complaints or to launch campaigns if you are perceived to have committed some sort of editorial error that they view as unforgivable. And so navigating that space is going to be an increasingly difficult, difficult question for the ABC, and we're going to have to prove that we're able to do it. The only way in the end that we can defend our journalism is by sticking to the absolute basics, which are absolutely essential, namely impartiality, fair-mindedness, broad-ranging consultation of all those concerned, and an absolute commitment to accuracy. But it is a tricky space, and social media, of course, fuels a lot of these questions as well, and a lot of these issues as well. Global issues can instantly, local issues can instantly become global ones. And you can, again, pointing to Khalistan as an example, write a story on Khalistan and find suddenly global organizations mobilizing to complain about an element of your story. That's not an entirely new phenomenon, but it's been supercharged by social media and by technology more broadly. So that's another thing we have to navigate in the foreign policy space. And then, of course, and this is the last observation I'll make before making a few quick observations on foreign policy and then going straight to questions. The news cycle is still speeding up. It's probably speeding up less quickly than it was a few years ago, in a sense. It felt like when the 24-hour news cycle really hit properly, there was a real sense of vertigo in newsrooms. How do we possibly keep up with this? Certainly in political offices, where they felt like initially around the early 2010s, mid-2010s, they were just being battered by the news cycle and they could barely grasp for air. That sense of panic has subsided slightly, but the news cycle, I think, is still in many ways speeding up. That is neither necessarily a good or a bad thing, but it brings risks as well as rewards. And the risk is that it eclipses that it narrows the time that we have to make considered editorial decisions, and it narrows the time that policymakers and decision makers have to make considered policy decisions. I have no particularly profound answers or insights on this other than to observe that it is difficult, and it's particularly difficult perhaps in the foreign policy space, even though there is often less intense day-to-day, hour-by-hour horse race coverage of foreign policy. Things can still catch on fire very quickly and get sucked up into the news cycle by me and by others very quickly, demanding an instantaneous government response. Ministers, and some ministers in particular, I think Wong is not bad at this, are still capable of actually carving out space to stop and think and to be deliberate. But those pressures, again, supercharged by social media in some, but not all cases, are still very intense. And in some ways, they are still intensifying, which is not a new problem for policymakers, but I think remains a pretty acute one. Fortunately, Australia hasn't yet been hit by the absolute polarization we have seen in the United States when it comes to the news cycle, the so-called red stream and blue stream, but we are starting to see elements of that emerge. This is not really a foreign policy question, but it relates to it. And I think we're seeing elements of that in parts of the, sort of sky after dark ecosystem, etc. And that, when you combine it with a news cycle that is continuing to speed up, I think does present policymakers some pretty profound questions and challenges. The ABC's job in all of this, of course, is to try and hold the centre. The centre must hold, and to try and preserve as much space as possible for reasonable, enlightened, fact-based discourse and debates. Even if you argue that fundamental objectivity is a hopeless daydream, as some people do, I maintain that striving for it is irreplaceably important. We have to continue to do it, because if we give up on that objective, we end up very quickly in a very dark space. So the ABC's job in this place, I think, is just to continue to focus on facts, to giving all reasonable opinions reasonable weight and time on air, and to never rush to get a story out before we are certain of the facts. Look, I was going to make a couple of observations about Australian foreign policy as well, but I'll probably just make a couple very, very brief ones. I don't think these are particularly revolutionary, but if you've got any questions or anything else, please on this, please hit me with it. I mean, I'm not going to, of course, venture a view on, the relative merits of any political party or anything like that. But broadly speaking, I think the consensus of those who watch the new government pretty closely is that they've had a pretty decent start in the foreign policy space. Some people would disagree with that reasonably, but I think it's been pretty steady. It's been, broadly speaking, pretty effective. And I think we forget sometimes just how rapid the pace of engagement has been, just how frenetic almost Penny Wong's schedule has been. Not only that, the way that people like Pat Conroy and Tim Watts have been deployed, as well as Tim Ayres and others around the globe. I think you can make a decent argument that the pace of engagement at a ministerial level and that sub-ministerial level has really ramped up. I think the government had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do with China, a very clear idea of where they wanted to go with Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and they have executed it, broadly speaking, pretty well. Definitely not flawlessly, but broadly speaking, pretty well. But I'd be very interested to hear what you guys think about what they've done well and what they've not done well, and what you make of my sort of fairly close observations of it. Look, more time for questions is always better than more time for me blathering on. So I'm going to cut it off there at 25 past, and would welcome any questions from you, Phil, to start off, or just from the audience. But comments or questions?
All right. Well, just at the outset, I'll go to questions initially in the in-person audience. If you could say your name and where you're from, and if you wouldn't mind standing up, because we're working from a sensitive microphone up at the front, that would be great. An impromptu question that flew into my mind at the beginning when you were talking about the pulling to the centre and fact-based journalism, whether there are ever any sort of tensions or blurry areas that arise between fact-based stories and both-sidism to a story.
Yeah. So, I mean, both-sidism is not the same thing as a facts-based. The idea that you have to sort of simply repeat both sides of the argument and leave it at that is, that is not, I mean, there's a few things going on. One, we often, particularly as the ABC, have an obligation to report what, for example, both sides of politics are saying about a story. That does not mean that we have to sort of treat both sides as equally magically true in all circumstances and hope that it sort of muddles out in some sort of magical formula, because it doesn't. The ABC's journalism, I think, is at its best when it interrogates, as well as simply reports on events and debates. And I think the ABC has, in some ways, become a bit more adept at doing that, particularly in the online space, which has in some ways freed up journalism. It's one more observation I'll just make quickly about how radically the media space has changed. When I started in the ABC in 2010 in Parliament House, there were basically 3 pods. There was a radio news pod, which is what I started in, which basically means you toil over a hot stove every day, writing endless, what we used to call copy grabs, which is basically 3 lines of copy, a grab from a politician, send it to the wire, done. It's then read out on the ABC News at 5 past the hour. That's all everyone did in that pod. There was a radio current affairs pod where you did 3 or 4 minute long radio current affairs stories. Bang, that's it. That's all you did. And then there were 2 people who did TV news for 7 p.m. and I think maybe the midday bulletin. That was it. The thought that you do anything else other than what you were there for was unthinkable. Now, if I have a story, I instantly send a breaking news alert to an internal system. That means it pings up on your phone. If you subscribe to the ABC, it pings up on everyone's internal emails. It goes up on the radio. They can read it straight to air. I then write a first 8 to 12 paragraph story, hopefully within the first 15, 20 minutes or so, to get that up straight away. I hop on the news channel, do a quick hit for about 6 minutes, explaining the story out. I return to the online story, expand it out so it hits more like 24 pars or something like that, but more substantive. I then start working my 7 p.m. news story. I might juggle a couple of radio interviews for ABC Radio on top of that, some local stations. Then I might turn my brain towards a live cross for, PM or something like that before returning to the online copy to give it another sort of, to expand on it further. That's a long and complicated way of saying that we have many, many more mouths to feed than we did, say, in 2010, and increasing amounts of our time is being hoovered up reporting on stories. We are now all multi-platform reporters. That is enormously liberating and overwhelmingly good for our journalism, but it does mean that we have less time perhaps to dig away at stories simply because we are so busy feeding those hungry mouths. But it also gives us a lot more space to avoid the false equivalence that you sometimes get with both siderisms, where you just do a copy grab from the Prime Minister, a copy grab from the opposition leader, done. Let the viewers or listeners decide. We've now got space to analyse, explain, contextualise across multiple platforms almost simultaneously. And that is a blessing much more than a curse.
Thank you. Questions? Rosemary?
Rosemary Ganley, with a background in defence. But my question goes directly to that. Do you have research workers? Do you actually have any backup? Or are you really bloody well on your own?
On my own, yeah.
So there's no research workers that you can call?
I don't have any research workers I can call on, no. There were, when I first started at the ABC, a few researchers for AM/PM The World Today from memory, and to some extent our teams are simultaneously, we are all each other's researchers, right? I try and help out my colleagues with background in research. My colleagues who are excellent at Parliament House, but also in the Asia Pacific Network, will help me out with quote unquote research. But no, it's not a very hierarchical organization, the ABC. It's very flat. I think it's largely a strength, but it means that we don't really have, I certainly don't have any staff, and I don't have any researchers, no.
Down the back there.
Hi, I'm Will. I'm a graduate with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We talked a lot about making media more accessible and indeed more interesting, making foreign policy more interesting. Are the provocative interventions from significant figures like Paul Keating useful in forcing the government to make the case for diplomatic tradecraft? I think defence is something that people sort of understand a little bit better because you have defence assets. It's very sort of physical. Can governments do a better job of explaining foreign policy to the public?
Thanks for the question. It's a really good one. Yeah, I mean, we didn't give Keating's most recent spray on Monday after the foreign minister's latest speech another run, not because, it wasn't entertaining, but because we felt we'd largely traversed that territory. That said, I think Keating's intervention, whatever you think of it, whether you disagree with it or agree with it, was a pretty useful accelerant for the debate. Now, a lot of people thought it was intemperate. A lot of people thought it was unnecessarily abusive in tone. I won't wade into that, but I think whatever you think of that question, I think it was useful and that it did bring some really hard questions to the fore for the government to answer. Could the government do a better job of explaining foreign policy? I mean, the answer to that is always going to be, broadly speaking, yes. Governments can always do a quote unquote better job. I think DFAT could. I mean, it's easy to criticize, right? I have sat on the other side very briefly, just as a locally engaged staff member with DFAT for a few years in Delhi. And I know it's hard to enliven foreign policy on, social media and the like. I still think a lot of DFAT media content is still pretty damn stodgy and formulaic. And yes, I think it could be done better, but it's also hard. And it's partially hard because, ministers, not just bureaucrats, but ministers have typically been very risk averse in this space for a long time, and public servants understandably make the calculation that it's not worth the candle, when the consequences for a disaster are still so high. Wong has spoken a bit, the foreign minister has spoken a bit about trying to create a bit more space for the department here. And I think we're probably seeing a little bit more movement, but a lot of it still feels pretty formulaic. So yes, the government can do a better job. But I'm not pretending that I somehow magically have a binder full of brilliant memes that will somehow wake the Australian population out to a profound understanding of the complexities of foreign nature and the government's handling of it. Fundamentally, these are often abstract, difficult conversations. Fundamentally, a lot of it is done necessarily behind closed doors. Readouts are not meant to be deeply exciting or interesting documents, nor are joint statements, even when they are. They are meant to require a bit of explanation. So yes, they could definitely do a better job, but I also acknowledge that it's very easy to criticize from the sidelines, and I recognize that some of the constraints do make it difficult. That said, look at what Canada and the UK are doing in this space at the moment in particular. There are more imaginative ways you can go about it. And I think a big part of that is, giving, in particular, mid-ranking or even junior officials the freedom to fail, a sense that if they make a mistake, it's not going to be an absolute killer to their career, allowing perhaps a bit more space for people to take risks and a bit more autonomy, including when they're in country. I think if you just acknowledge that it will create a few difficulties now and then, but overwhelmingly, it's going to create a much more persuasive, nimble, capable, likable, relatable diplomatic corps that can actually engage with a broader public and publics in the country that they're in. I mean, for me, I think it's a non-starter. You should absolutely give people more freedom of maneuver. But I'm a journo, so I would say that.
I'm just going to go online for a moment and then I'll come back to questions here. Sally Burt is with us tonight on Zoom, and she asks, what in your view, Stephen, is the biggest foreign policy issue or conflict that's being neglected by Australians that they should actually be paying attention to at the moment?
Neglected by Australians. So not the Australian government,
probably
but
the audience.
By the audience, yeah. So what is an issue that deserves more public attention, I guess, or that people are probably, well, I mean,
a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, this is an issue that I'll nominate, not because it's perhaps the single biggest one, but I'm always the issue that's neglected, but which I think is a really interesting one, which deserves more coverage and more attention. I mean, the government talks a lot about, existential risks to the Pacific, and I'm sure that they're serious and they mean it when they say it. But I'm not sure that everyone has really grasped collectively in their gut just how transformative this is going to be, climate change for the Pacific. Like, it's one thing to say it, countries are going to disappear under the water. Science is telling us countries are going to disappear under the water. And I think a lot of people, including myself, mouth that every so often without actually truly grasping the heft and weight of it, perhaps. So at the moment, you've got Pacific Island countries essentially going through a process where they're working how they can pin down their boundaries, basically not quite, but almost sort of setting them where they are, in the event that the land features that are used to define those countries' maritime boundaries, which as we know are vast, get swamped, as they will be on the current trajectory. It's brought up every so often, the idea of some sort of grand compact between Australia and the Pacific. And, it's always talked about almost as if it's a parlor game. I mean, I'm sure there are people in RGKC thinking hard about this. I hope they are. But that is a really real prospect in the next 2-3 decades, perhaps sooner. What does a country look like if it's totally obliterated and it lives entirely through a diaspora in Auckland and Sydney with only memories of its homeland? It's actually a profound question, and it raises incredibly difficult foreign policy questions around access, questions around nationality and sovereignty. Perhaps this is something that will come into clearer view over the next little while, and I'm nominating something that's going to be a huge story in 10 years and rather than now. But I sometimes, and I include myself, just wonder if we've really grappled just with that element of climate change, leaving alone the broader questions of how climate change is going to fuel broader regional instability, movements of people, political unrest. I think one of the reasons why the climate story is so hard is because whilst the science is knowable and the broad sort of facts of it are knowable, the geopolitical implications are very difficult to pin down. We know that the ONI has done an assessment. The government will not release it because it draws on classified material of the climate risks for Australia in the region. There's going to be a separate piece of work that will look more closely at what's happening what might happen inside Australia and national security risks. The story has not been ignored by any strength of by any token of the imagination, but I feel like this is something we're really going to have to turn our minds to as a media, as a government, and collectively as a society very quickly.
Indeed. Back to the room, Des.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Desmond Woods, ACT branch councillor. Before the last election, there was quite a bit of discussion about the way in which the previous government turned off shortwave and made it very difficult for the ABC to be heard in its traditional audiences in the Pacific. And the suspicion was that though it was convenient to turn off shortwave for Australia, that government didn't mind that the ABC wasn't being heard. And we heard horrendous stories that in the very Christian Pacific, people are now being offered married at first sight as examples of Australian culture. This wasn't exactly the kind of soft power we had in mind. Have things improved? I know we haven't turned back on shortwave, but have we now got the ABC back where it should be, talking to people seriously about things that matter to them and projecting a more positive image of Australia?
So it's a very fair question, and I, in all honesty, do not know enough about the specifics of the shortwave debate. I know there were intense debates around both within the ABC, but also within the government about that decision at the time. And I know many people and many long-time listeners in the ABC in the Pacific were very critical of that decision. Others I know, including I think internally in the ABC, have argued that in the end, shortwave, whilst reaching a significant audience, was not as indispensable as some of its champions presented. I honestly do not know enough about the raw about that issue to comment on it. I'm not trying to follow off your question. I'm just never taking the time to really delve into that question, partly because it happened slightly before I started in this role. And so I wouldn't want to offer I don't think I can offer a really educated opinion on that. The beaming of commercial TV in the Pacific in particular was a pretty contentious one. Obviously, I'm going to prefer seeing the ABC in all circumstances beamed out there. I think the rationale behind it was just that it was good to expose people in the region to Australian culture. Whether maths is or is not Australian culture, I do not know. Was it Married at First Sight? Was that what it was?
And similar.
I haven't watched an episode. I'm hopelessly ignorant.
Similar low level.
It's all I can say is that the ABC is intent on the work that we are now doing to really step up our Pacific coverage, to provide high quality content, to provide news and current affairs about Australia, but also about the Pacific. Obviously, we are free from commercial pressures, which is a blessing. And gives us the space to put stuff out on merit and nothing else. And that our new network of journalists that we're now building across the Pacific will also have an absolutely laser-like focus on quality and high-quality journalism and nothing else. I could be a politician with that answer, couldn't I? Laser-like.
This sort of cuts across a question from Alistair online, who was in similar territory that last year the BBC World Service announced significant cuts to its foreign language broadcasts, cancelling, among others, Chinese and Indonesian broadcasts.
Yeah.
So going to the broader soft power issue, could there be a role here for the ABC in the region, and any comments you might like to make?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm going to say, because I don't have to worry about money, absolutely. My boss is going to worry about that. No, I mean, look, I think there is probably at the moment a very clear focus in the ABC, as there is in the government. And that's partly because, we've got money from government with a very clear set of, we get, to be clear, no writing instructions from the government whatsoever on any of our content, obviously, as everyone knows here. But for example, the money we got most recently from the budget is specifically for the Pacific, right? Yeah. So that's money that we devote to the Pacific. Now, as it happens, that dovetails with our priorities anyway. Carving out money to branch out more broadly into places where, for example, the BBC has very sadly, I think, now moved out of. I mean, personally, just as an ABC journal, of course, I'd love to see our content expand to places like that. But in the end, that's going to be a decision for my bosses to make, because they've got to make those calculations. And to some extent, because increasingly, I think, and there's an interesting debate we can have about the ABC's role combined with, the government's geopolitical imperatives here, because they're similar, but they are not the same, right? Yeah. But similarly, that's obviously the government's priority. So we have been given funding in the most recent budget to expand broadcasting specifically in the Pacific.
Indeed.
And that will, I suspect, along perhaps with Southeast Asia, will remain our key focus.
Yeah. Gentleman with his hand up just there.
Rod Holsgrove, in background in international environment policy. I was actually involved in drafting some work for the yellow governments, and as you know, they had I'm going to be a bit political here. They did have a fairly good policy on climate change in the Pacific, which was completely abolished by the coalition for the last 10 years. So then we had the Pacific step up. So now, and I actually wouldn't mind your comments on the Keating thing. And Hugh White says a similar line that Australia's got two choices: either we go all the way with the USA, or we have a more independent foreign policy. I'm just wondering if you objectively can comment. Do you think the new government is creating a new, more independent foreign policy? Well, is Keating correct? And Hugh White's worried that we're going to be still all the way, with AUKUS in the US.
Yeah.
Any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I as a journo rather than someone of the heft of Hugh, I would simply say a couple of things. I think the first thing to say is that it's worth going back to Wong's speech. I think I mentioned to you beforehand, the United States. I think Hugh mentions it also in his most recent monthly essay. Again, I'm not necessarily endorsing that essay, but draws out. I think that speech had a few really interesting contributions from the FM around shaping American foreign policy. And also, I think the language that she deployed around the risks of catastrophe, you get the clear sense from this government and certainly from the foreign minister that there's a sense of worry that the US is undercounting the prospect of catastrophic escalation, or is just a little bit, not blasé, but that it's not weighting that full risk perhaps. The language there, I think, was very interesting. I personally don't believe, that the foreign minister is simply tying Australia to the United States. I think she's carving out some pretty clear spaces where there are differences of opinion. But unsurprisingly, perhaps the government has made the assessment that it's absolutely crucial that the US stays in the region as the most significant part of a balancing coalition, right? With isolationist trends in the United States as they are, this is not an original, observation. That's something that Wong wants to push quite clearly. So, leaving aside, some of those broader questions, I think Wong's vision is very much her own, and I think the accusation that Australian foreign policy is little more than an offshoot of US foreign policy is, broadly speaking, pretty mistaken.
Yeah. I think there's a question on the right.
Yeah.
Hannah.
Thank you for your reflections. I'm Hannah. I'm studying at the ANU. Admittedly, my question is quite similar to the first online question we had, but you mentioned that it's very difficult to garner interest from audiences in the near region in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, let alone further afield. And a phrase I've heard touted quite frequently is this notion of the forgotten conflict, the forgotten crisis. So I guess a broad question to you was, how do you see media's role in balancing that kind of day-to-day churn of current events with the ongoing atrocities or crises in far-flung suffering places? So Yemen is an example, the Sahel is an example. How do you see that sort of moral imperative to balance for reporting and interest?
It's a great question. It's hard, right? It's really hard because you've got to balance a few things. One, the merits of the story. Two, audience interest in the story and our obligations to try and put stories out that are going to be read. Three, distance is a factor. It's a factor in my calculations. If something is happening in our near neighbourhood, I immediately pay it more attention than something that's happening a long way away. And then fourth, of course, it's the pure moral imperative that suffering is the same across the globe. Catastrophe has equal moral weight across the globe. And some stories simply demand attention. There's no easy answer to this. It's simply a constant balancing act. The other thing is just disaster fatigue. Again, this is not a new observation. When Myanmar first, when the military seized power in Myanmar, there was intense interest from all of our readers, watchers, and listeners. Intense interest, but it fades. Right? It fades, and it's been fading for a long time. And in some ways, it has become harder and harder to get people to care about Myanmar and to tell stories that people want to read and listen and watch about Myanmar, simply because people have now, in a weird way, almost baked in the horror to their day-to-day calculations. Does that make sense? Well, it sounds a horrible way to put it. Everyone works around, they know that Myanmar is a waking nightmare, right, today. They know what's happening. And they simply are not going to click on the story. So then we face that calculation. To what extent do we have to devote resources trying to find ways to make this story interesting and compelling to people, as opposed to devoting time, for example, doing more investigations around what's happening in our immediate region, writing something that's going to get more attention, perhaps about China and the Pacific or something like that. There's no formula for that. It's simply a day-to-day operation and a day-to-day calculus. And I think the most important thing is that we don't ever entirely forget the clear moral case for stories, even if they are far-flung and are not easy to draw an audience to.
I think someone was trying it back there, the lady with the glasses.
That's Isabella, I think.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I write this week in the Australian Foreign Affairs column for this institute, and I was thinking back to Tim Watts's comments at this institute's conference to a masterclass late last year to young people in foreign affairs, which similarly, as you touched on, talked about this issue of engaging young people. And I was curious as to if, I hope as a relatively young person that this isn't an issue of lack of genuine interest. But I'm curious firstly as to whether you think this is like a trend that is beginning, that people are becoming less interested in foreign policy and foreign affairs news, or is it an issue of like lack of accessibility? I mean, perhaps that's not something you can completely answer, but I am curious as to if this is like a perennial problem or something that's emerged more recently.
So it's difficult to say. It's a great question. We don't have, or I don't have access to the very fine-grained data on, for example, the profile of people who read my stories on foreign policy. Anecdotally, I think I pick up quite a bit of interest from a probably small cohort of young people who are deeply engaged in foreign policy. I don't think there's anything particularly, I mean, to answer your question, no, I don't believe that young people are somehow uniquely indifferent to foreign policy or even perhaps less interested in foreign policy. I think it mirrors some of the trends we're seeing more broadly with politics, in that it's often more difficult to engage young people in politics or in foreign policy. But once you find a way to do it, you find a very ready, willing, and often quite passionate audience. But a lot of the hacks or a lot of the formula that we have developed over time don't work. We need to it seems there's now enough evidence we need to find new ways to engage people. That doesn't necessarily mean dumbing it down, but it does often mean reframing some of these questions. Perhaps in some instances, it might mean that we take a slightly less didactic tone, because unconsciously there's often a fairly didactic tone to a lot of foreign policy coverage. We try not to, but it's hard, it creeps in sometimes. The thing you need to understand here, so that might be part of it. My main problem, I guess, is that for whatever reason, that a lot of the platforms where young people seem to be getting their news, and I don't think this is anything necessarily profound about young people, it's just the nature of the beast, but they prioritize the immediate, and there is precious little space and time to play with. And that's hard, not just for complex policy, it's particularly difficult for foreign affairs. And that's, as I mentioned, what I'm still grappling with. That said, sometimes you get comments from people like random 19-year-olds who just write in, who know terrifying amounts about what's happening in the interplay between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it's a good reminder that there are also an awful lot of very lazy tropes about young people out there that bear no resemblance to reality.
Well, that's reassuring that we're not witnessing the national shrinking of concentration spans.
No, I think we are, but I don't think it's, no, sorry, I should be clear. I think we are witnessing a diminishing of attention spans, including mine.
Yes.
And I think it's a national problem. I just do not buy the idea that it's some way unique to young people.
Yeah.
I think if you look at what's happening with Facebook, this is not foreign policy. What's happening with some of the anti-vax stuff, and in particular, not drawing attention to any one generation, but there's data out there on 55 to 70-year-olds on Facebook, and anti-vax stuff is petrifying. Now, it's also there with younger people, but Jesus Christ, it's terrifying. And that is in some ways a function of shrinking attention spans. It's also about conspiratorial or magical thinking being mainstreamed across platforms that have shamelessly, shockingly, and disgracefully monetized it. But that's not a problem with young people, or at least not young people alone.
I think we had one at the very back behind the previous questioner. Yep. And then you, sir, at front.
Daniel from Department of Defence. Thanks very much for your reporting. I have to admit, sometimes the first place we see information is from you.
Oh, that's good to know. It's a relief.
Let's talk a bit about how you source your stories about Pacific and some of your experiences with asking questions of Pacific governments, how you go about getting information from them, how they respond to your questions.
It's a slow and painful process because a lot of the imperatives of day-to-day journalism in Australia, particularly political journalism, do not translate to the Pacific at all. And this will not surprise people who know the Pacific quite well. And it's a very, very casual and lazy assumption that journos make that you can pick up the phone to the press sec of the Prime Minister of Fiji or Solomon Islands and get a response in 8 hours, or sometimes 4 hours. Like I have seen, in fact, I won't say who, but one Pacific official who I know quite well forwarded me an email from an unnamed Australian journal asking for a comment in the next 37 minutes, which I laughed at for the next 3 days. I am fortunate I built up a bit of a contact base in Pacific governments, but that's only done through constant building up of respectful relationships and building up of trust. It's no different to Australian officials or anyone else, multilateral organizations working in the Pacific. You cannot simply rock up and expect a response. You've got to build relationships of trust over time, and then you are in a position to share information on the basis of mutual trust. So that's the way that I've done it. But I'm also fortunate in that because I cover foreign policy in the Pacific, I have the time to do that. Many other journalists, including the one I perhaps unfairly mocked just then, simply don't have that luxury or time. So of course they're going to get on the phone to the Prime Minister's press second demand something in 37 minutes because that's all they have time to do. But what has been rewarding over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly as geopolitical tensions have increased in the Pacific, is the fact that I feel like I've now got, I mean, by no means, a bird's eye view of everything happening. I miss an awful lot. Journos always do. The Australian government does. But I do feel like I've now got a better sense of the way the Pacific is responding to some of these geopolitical events, to the broader sense of flux. And I hope that informs my coverage and will continue to inform my coverage.
Very good. Over here.
So I'm Sam Tice. I'm studying at the University of Canberra. I'm studying politics and international relations. I wanted to ask, what do you think of the role of social media is for professionals working in politics and foreign affairs? So just broadly, I think it was kind of, you touched on it with an earlier question.
Yeah.
But
So it's a good question. Increasingly, people are concluding, media organizations are concluding that Twitter is not worth the candle, and other social media sites perhaps aren't. It's probably more useful still to me because even though there are deep problems with Twitter under Musk, and I feel enormous anxiety about the future of the platform, it's still a place where a lot of foreign policy professionals go. And it's also a place where a lot of academics, analysts, former diplomats and others still keep a pretty close eye on. So you can form a very useful professional network through Twitter and actually form new professional contacts through Twitter. And you can also narrowcast very effectively in Twitter to that audience, which is what I do with a lot of Canberra gossip stuff, which is not going to interest the broader public, but which is going to, draw interest in RG Casey or wherever else, but also, and this is the real reason I do it, hopefully draw more people out to give me more information. And also people who will then tell me things that actually matter down the line. Probably shouldn't have said that out. So it's a useful narrowcasting sort of platform, but I do think we need to recognize its limitations. It's not a mass audience, even though lots of people are on it. It's increasingly plagued by bots. There are some really troubling things happening under Musk at the moment. And increasingly, I think people are starting to search further afield. I myself am looking further afield at other options, notes, etc. But social media can be a useful narrowcasting and amplification tool, but we should not mistake it for the real world.
Heath.
Oh, Penny first.
Okay,
Penny.
Penny Wensley, fellow of the Institute and member of the ACT branch. You focused pretty heavily in the discussion on the Pacific. I'd like to take you back to where you were talking about woeful attention to Indonesia. Could you tell us a bit more about what needs to be done from your viewpoint to raise awareness and engage Australians more interest in Southeast Asia, which is the other half of the hat you wear?
Yes, it's a great question. Thank you so much for coming. It's a real honor to have you here, Penny. That's my KPI actually at the moment. In fact, when I spoke to my boss a few days ago, that's one of the main things we discussed. One, I think we probably have collectively, we have a great Indonesia correspondent. We also have an Indonesia language team, Erwin and others, who do great work online and with Anne and others. But I think we just need to devote more time and effort to it. I think we just need to write more stories about Indonesia and find ways to make it compelling. and be willing to suck up a few failures in the process, even if they aren't particularly engaging. We're trying to engage the Indonesian diaspora a little bit more, but of course, the Indonesian diaspora in Australia is, as you know, not as large as some other groups, and has not traditionally been as engaged with the ABC as some other groups. So that's something that we're still trying to work on. We are very conscious that there are too many, Bali, people smuggling, sort of cattle stories about Indonesia. I think we need to, again, and I know my colleagues are thinking about this as well, find ways to tell stories about Indonesian politics and its own merits, rather than just relating it back to Australia. I think the next presidential contest is going to be a really exciting opportunity for us to do that. There was some excellent coverage the ABC did out of it last time. It didn't always get the attention that it merited. I think we need to probably devote more time to promoting those stories on our major platforms as well, rather than making the assumption, as occasionally may happen, that it's only going to be for a particular audience. I mean, I'm sure, I know my boss is thinking about these things. I'm thinking about these things. Our excellent Indonesia correspondent, who's doing great work, is absolutely thinking about this stuff as well. But not just Indonesia. We also need to find ways to talk more about Southeast Asia, and tell more stories about Southeast Asia to a mass audience.
I think we've got time for one more from Heath before we start to wrap up.
Thanks very much. Heath McMahon, ICT branch president. I'm just building on the good question from Penny there, and asking really, can you shed some light on the process of selecting ABC foreign correspondents? I mean, it's a question I should be asking Ida Butler.
Yeah, ask Ida. I have no idea. I've never applied.
Whether you have a view on that, because it does seem to be important in terms of preparing correspondents for their assignment. You mentioned a bit about getting language is that what sort of thought processes or preparations do foreign correspondents go through to take up an assignment?
A very good question. I'm hopelessly ignorant because I'm a Canberra reporter, and I've never actually, I've done lots of reporting overseas, but I've never been posted overseas, so I have no personal experience of it, largely because I have young kids. Look, I don't have any particularly brilliant insights because I've also never selected anyone to be a foreign correspondent. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into telling, to finding the right person, people with the right either particular storytelling skills, particular interest or expertise in the country. Competition is absolutely intense, and unsurprisingly, I would say this, I think our corros do a pretty good job, very good job. But I feel terribly ill-equipped to answer your question just because it's a bit above my pay grade. Sorry. I'm fine to go a few more if you want.
Sure.
Only if you're keen.
Yeah, we do need to close out the broadcast at 7, unfortunately. So, with that, we are nearing the top of the hour. So, look, fascinating insights, Stephen. Thank you so much this evening, and hearing about the pace of your day and how a story develops. I think it serves as a great reminder about how hard people in the ABC work and in journalism more broadly, but also how we see the finished product, but what actually goes on behind it and the deep care that's also brought to bear with it. So we thank you very much this evening. It's been a terrific insight. So thank you.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for having me.